This should be good. Hello. I mean, I forgot that I'm doing an English live. Good afternoon. This will be my first English live. So, good evening. I can't tell who's there, but good evening. Thanks for coming. We're going to be discussing um, mental health. It's going to be an interesting discussion because I recently read a book, and since I'm really, besides talking about health, I also love history. I also love politics, although I'm not I'm not really into politics like you guys think, but I love politics because if you're gonna talk about anything in society, there's no way you cannot not talk about politics or not get into it. And obviously, health is one of those subjects where politics is a big part of health. You can't really talk about health without diving into the politics of it, you know. So I recently read a book, and I was well. I knew about this subject because obviously I grew up in Haiti, and this book is the story took place in Haiti, so I knew about that story. But after reading the book, I started really to think about how sometimes the environment that we grow up in and how that affects our mental health, and how it can have a huge impact on the way we see the world, based on how the environment was and what is it that we took from the environment and that we actually internalize, which can impact our health greatly. So I'm going to introduce the book and read a few snaps of it, inside of it, and then we'll discuss how it actually relates to mental health. I can't really, I turn my camera, so I have to look at the iPad and see what I'm seeing. So please share the live so that others can come for the discussion. And thank you for coming. Thank you for actually joining me tonight. I'm going to introduce the book. So I'm going to read actually the title of the live for tonight because I think it's worth mentioning. The title of the post that I posted yesterday was "Slavery, Widely Recognized as the Most Notable Crime Against Humanity, Has Many Consequences. Yet one of its worst of these effects is its impact on one's mental health. Africa, a victim of alienation and arguably psychic brutality of religions, Islam and Christianity to be exact, led to the plight of political domination, where insecurity and social instability of former colonies of our era reign. The testimonies of several conscious authors and victims who testify to their plight are expressed here in their own words. Example, Castro de Roche in his book titled Tales from the Island of Papa Doc. I, Marlene, I'm a nurse and a health guru. I will be discussing these subjects with you tonight, specifically the relationship between neocolonialism imposed by powerful colonial governments and its effect on one's mental health. So that's the title of what I'm going to be discussing. So here's the book. This is the book. This is what the book looked like. This book was written by a Haitian author. His name is Castro de Roche. The subject is actually a pretty common subject. A lot of authors have written books about this particular subject, which is his is titled Tales from the Island of Papa Doc. Papa Doc was a dictator in Haiti. He reigned, I think, for about from 57, something like that, and I think he died in not too long. But then his son was his successor, and I believe, you know, politically, the country remained the same under his regime, which was chronic terrorism in the country. So the book talks about this boy, talks about his recollection of what his life was like in Haiti at that time. And of course, he gives a very good rendition on what it is that it was like and how everyone around him, how he felt they dealt with that kind of terror. He uses a lot of humor in the book, which is good because this is a very heavy subject, but he uses a lot of humor, which makes it very, very palatable. I read most of the book actually. And after reading it, I just couldn't help thinking about, you know, our mental health, especially, you know, I grew up in Haiti and I understand I've always had questions about my own mental health, of course, and in the mental health of some of my friends who also grew up in Haiti. And I have to say, there's no way we can discuss mental health as a people, you know, Black people, without understanding our background, our experiences that we've had with terror. Since I opened the post with slavery, because a lot of the systems in the colonial countries who were colonized, who were, you know, who were enslaved also, you can't talk about the effects of what's going on in those countries right now without really not mentioning what had happened before. You know, what systems were left in place right now that is now a continuity of those former systems. So we know, for example, because of slavery, the political strife that goes on in a lot of countries as a result later on, like this dictatorship, is directly related to systems that were left behind, that is still dominating. So when in this story, Papa Doc, who was the president, the dictator at that time, had the you know, the Tonton Macoutes, who were really the you know, they were kind of like the police, the army. It was like an army, his own army, that he used to literally unleash terror on the civilians. And as a result, it was a very dark time for a lot of Haitians. A lot of Haitians fled the country at that time because of that, because, you know, he was, it was really bad. So people who lived at that time, I often wondered about them. You know, they lived in such terror that it was almost like chronic terrorism. If you think about it, that's what it was. To have chronic terror and to live that day to day, that must have an impact on one's mental health. So that is what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to be read some excerpt from the book. Let me see if you guys have any questions. 3 comments. Let's see. Good evening, Mercy Vierge Williams. Good evening. Jorge Cruz. Hola. Good evening, Harriet Bless, Romy, Tashia. Good evening. So 71. Oh, yes. Thank you. Yeah, 71. But then his son, of course, reigned until 86. So that gave an additional 15 years. So I guess 66, something like that, or 67. So a little under 30 years, I guess they reign. Yes. So I'm going to read one excerpt for you from the book, just to give you an idea what kind of terror we are talking about here. The author wrote, "When the moon locally known as the State Company of Electricity, was taking a nap from shining so bright. Lugao, traveling at the speed of light, leaped from one roof to the next in search of the young blood and the tender meat of innocent newborns. On the island, natural death was unheard of. It was just a scam invented by foreigners to hide the fact that evil forces were at stake everywhere around us. The night was the twilight zone, a narrow corridor in the valley of shadow, time of curfew, time of anguish, time of agonizing fear. Nonetheless, Lugao and sharks were overrated. Some other beasts were on top of the food chain. They had human face like you and me. They had the blue uniform and the carnivalesque red bandana around their neck. Some tontons had warlord machine guns. Some had pistols. The poorest of the poor, the low caliber exterminators, carried their machetes openly in the street of Papadopoulos. Papadopoulos is the name that the author used to refer to Port-au-Prince, which is the city, which is the capital of Haiti. So in this excerpt, as you can hear, he is actually describing the fear and the fear that one would have if one would encounter one of those tonton macoute, because these were the army, like I said, but this was not your typical army that you would think is there to bring protection to a country. These were used, literally, this force was used to bring fear and terror into a small island. Haiti is a very small island. So having this type of fear on a very small area where everyone is together must have been very, very dramatic. It must have had a dramatic effect on everyone. And I often wonder about myself as I was growing up in Haiti. I also remember just hearing the name Papa Doc. And even as a child, I remember the type of effect it had on me. I didn't really know much about him, nor did I needed to know the history, but just the way people would just talk about him and the way they would not talk about him as well, or talk about him mostly in codes or in silence, led me to believe as a child that this was a very fearful man, a very fearful time. Adults also acted the same way when they talked about him as well. So mental health, when you think about it, when in its definition, really, we often think, especially us, when someone has maybe depression or anxiety or maybe schizophrenia or some other titles, that's when we think about mental health. When in actuality, on a daily basis, our day-to-day life, the way we see the world, the way we understand our reality, is what's going to dictate if we are actually mentally healthy or we are unhealthy. And living in such fear, living in such terror would only lead one to believe that obviously no one was really mentally healthy in a state like that. And no one after that who lives with something like that can actually call themselves mentally healthy. It would be very challenging for someone to continuously struggle with mental health after being exposed to a time like this. So, of course, people can cope. People will always try to find a way to cope, those who can cope. Those who can't cope obviously will succumb to the terror. But even those who cope, they will also have to explain their own coping mechanism eventually at some time later on in life to themselves, in terms of they've coped with the situation that they had to deal with, but now they're left with the remnants of what do I do with this coping mechanism sometimes, because you don't really need it anymore later on because you have to get rid of it. It's sort of like, something that you use to a stepping stone. So at some point you have to let it go. And that's the difficult part sometimes in mental health, where people who have suffered traumatic events, it's very hard for them to let go of whatever coping mechanism they had used in order to get over whatever that is. So when you think about that time of brutality spoken in the book, you can't help but think, how was that even possible to be in such a small island? How was that even possible for that to happen for almost over 30 years? And since then, it has happened many more times. And when you go back way back on the thread, you realize there are systems that are in place already that actually promote, and not only promote, but maintain such systems in place. If we talk about, for example, we mentioned in the religion, Islam and Christianity, in the society, after a traumatic event, usually people have to give it meaning. What does the traumatic event mean? What does it mean? First, that's the first thing they have to do. And if what we use to give something its meaning is how we see the world, how we see our reality. So religion plays a big role into how someone sees their reality. So, and at the same time, if the religion is not one with the person, meaning it's something that was borrowed, for example, it's something that was forced upon you. You make it yours, yes, but because it was something that you were forced to accept, there's always going to be a part of it that you cannot reconcile because it's really not yours. And if it wasn't yours, then that means there was something that you had to give up in order to pick this one up. And we know during slavery, that's what had happened. They forced people to become Christians, and they forced them to believe that becoming Christians they would go to heaven and so forth. And it was the best ticket out of slavery. It wasn't really, freedom wasn't their ticket out of slavery, but accepting to become a Christian, and then when they die, they would go to heaven. That was the best they can do coming out of slavery, believe it or not. So you can imagine how then someone's mental health is sort of corroded with that type of understanding later on, because you can't reconcile that belief with what you're actually experiencing. Here you have you're worshiping a God who is supposed to be a God that's supposed to have mercy on you. But yet you're worshiping this God who doesn't have any mercy on you, in a way, because you are still a slave. So fast forward, we still have this religion that we pray to. So you could see how mentally it's difficult for someone to reconcile that. And when you cannot reconcile two events to a finality in your own psyche, that then leaves sort of like it leaves a residue of, whether you know it or not, it leaves a residue in your psyche. And that can be considered it definitely is mentally unhealthy. Let me see if you guys have any questions. Thank you, Messivier. She has such a wonderful life, she said. Messivier said sometimes the traumatized person develop depression. They pacifying it with alcohol, anger, and abuse. Definitely, Messivier. Yes. Actually, the author talks about a couple of characters in his own life. His uncle, two uncles. His uncle and his father, who were both drinkers. He had an uncle who disappeared during the time of the Tonton Macoute, during the time of the Papa Doc era. And as a result, the second brother who lost the brother became an alcoholic, where he was drinking all the time. And I questioned, as I was reading the book, what led him to drink so heavily, because he was a heavily drinker. And certainly alcohol, he talks about in the book how alcohol was used as a something to numb the people. He talks about this at length. Let me see if I could find, I had a part I was going to read about that actually. But yes, he talked about that, alcohol was a big part of the society's era. And we know that in Haiti, people do, the men especially do tend to drink a lot. So here he talks about, I wanted to read this part where he talks about another issue that I feel that I should bring up, talking about mental health. He talked about his, I think it was his birth actually, his brother, this uncle actually, who was having a child being born, and it was late at night during the time of this terror time, which is during the Papa Doc era. He talks about how at night, nobody goes out at night, because if you were caught out, if they caught you walking around or whatever at night, you could die. They could use the machetes or the machine guns and just kill you. And here he is, that someone was to give birth, and they had to bring them to the hospital, but they didn't really know what to do, because it was either they let them give birth at home or take them to the hospital. And here's a part of that. He said, it was dangerously late at the little house of Martissa. They had to make a critical decision to go or not to go in the lingering atmosphere of witch hunt and women profiling. Titine, the midwife, was no longer around. Titine was a midwife in Martissa who used to help out with midwifery, giving birth. As though it were a horror story of the Middle Ages, Titine had been labeled, positively identified as Lugao. She was accused of being a predator who selected this noble profession, midwife, not which, in order to prey on the babies she would bring into the world for a short period of time. Enough time to visit the planet and gain some baby fat, but not enough time for the kiddies to get a sense of their own existence and recognize themselves in the mirror. I'm sure all of you had heard stories about this when I was a kid in Haiti. I remember hearing about the Lugao and how mainly they wanted, baby fat specifically, which I have to tell you, as a child, you hear that, it's pretty disturbing, because now you're thinking they're going to eat, actually, cannibalism. For her, any little hole in the roof was a window of opportunity to insinuate herself into a house, to suck blood and have supper. Anyway, it was the narrative that was flying around from mouth to ear about Titine, who was the midwife Titine. Quite often, babies would pass away mysteriously, even before they got the chance to be baptized. You would think they were children of a lesser god. You would think they were Pitimi Sangado, a garden of Millet without a guardian. In a memorable homily in Latin that everyone understood miraculously, Father Alexandre revealed under horrified parishioners that the lack of baptism certificate would leave babies in limbo and complicate their admission into heaven. So the father in the community at that time had all the mothers to believe that if their children were baptized in a frenzy, which I used to hear as well, unless the child is baptized, then the Lugao was much easier for the Lugao to sort of like snatch your baby. So baptism, the Catholic baptism, was actually sort of like a solution to this problem. Everybody, faithful Christians, devoted worshipers, impenetrable procrastinators, even those who were not in order of sanctity with the church because they were absent regularly, were summoned to fulfill their religious duties towards their newborns without further delay. In a firm, unusual tone, Father Alexandre threatened to excommunicate those who refused to comply. So here it is again. You can see how religion um, played a big mind games, really, on top of a situation that was already a horrifying situation, where the people were led to believe that if your child weren't baptized, then it was much likely that the lugao, which was already, we could put a question mark next to that in terms of its validity, the witch, that is, if the child wasn't baptized, that it was much more likely that the lugao had access to the babies, the kiddies, as the author wrote about. So what does that type of belief, those types of belief, what does those type of belief does to someone's mental health? Because mental health, like I said, it's clearly closely linked to how we see the world, what is reality to us, how do we understand our own reality. So I remember back in Haiti being a child, being very scared of a lot of things that I probably should have actually enjoyed, such as the dark. Now I enjoy the dark once I'm able to understand there's nothing fearful about the dark. But I remember being a child and being very scared about the dark. And I'm pretty sure that it had left its mark on me in terms of a negative understanding of it, how I must have suffered. So now imagine even grown adults suffering from a belief and understanding that if their childs are not baptized, that they are then at risk for a witch to snatch them while they are sleeping. And that's the result. Those types of beliefs does affect how well we can be on a day-to-day basis, not just when we're thinking about it, but it colors our entire imagination on how we see the world, and how we not only see the world, but how we move into the world. The decisions that we make every day. Do we become a person who's anxious and depressed all the time? Do we start having having some phobias because of that? Do we have anxiety because of that? Do we end up giving birth to children with schizophrenia because of that? I haven't done any research myself. I haven't read any research myself, but I would think to believe that in a society like that, plus you add the fact that there was real terror at that time for 30 years that was going on in the era, you couple those two facts, and there are many other factors that the author mentions in the book that were part of the chronic terror, you could see how that would affect someone's mental health for years to come. But not just someone, but the entire community, and eventually the entire country, and how they see themselves, how they see the world, how they move into the world, etc., etc. Let me see if you guys have any questions. Yes, Pierre Simon. It is a very complex subject. I am kind of just touch and go a little bit on each one. Not even each one, a little bit, but it's very complex. But at least it will give some people an idea on when we talk about mental health, especially us Black people, we should never really stop at some of the definitions that we see in books. We should never just stop there. And we should never even take it for granted, even the diagnosis that they are giving to us. For example, if I go to the doctor and I might have something going on with me, and they might say, well, I'm depressed. And I may be depressed, but I'm not sure if I'm depressed only because of what's going on in my life now. There's no way I cannot attach that depression or that sadness to something that happened long ago when I was a child, but even further than that, further than that into the people who lived before me, the people who gave birth to me. We all know now, based on research that's done, DNA research, we do know that things are passed through the DNA. How do I know that my depression today, the sadness that I have today, how do I know that that's not related actually to something that happened 400 years ago in a plantation somewhere? How do I know that's not related? And that pretty much that could be related. So giving my depression that definition obviously would help me to understand myself. But we take it even much further, not even further back, but more recently, if for somebody like, who grew up, like the author talks about in his book, somebody who grew up in that era, in the Duvalier era, the Papa Doc era, I would tend to believe that their depression, their anxiety, just much like a lot of Jews talk about how a lot of the depressions are related to what happened in Auschwitz, we can also say a lot of our depression, maybe a lot of our angst, a lot of our anxiety could very well be related to what happened in the plantation. So those systems are still in force and they still affect us greatly. The Holocaust, correct. Thank you, Merci Vierge. You're so great with me tonight. Exactly, the Holocaust. And it's interesting, we Black people, we never talk about that. Here it is. We celebrate, this is Black History Month. We celebrate Black History Month and stuff like that. But we never actually tie those things. We're not even allowed to tie it together. Every time, if we try to say something like, well, this happened to us, people say, oh, well, that was long ago. But other people can say, well, it happened to us and it's still affecting us today. But we don't talk about it like that. And when we're talking about mental health, we should think about it like that. We should talk about it like that, specifically because these systems are actually still in place. The Holocaust happened long ago and it's done, and that those systems are no longer in place for the Jews. But for us, it's still in place. I'm not in a plantation right now, but the intimidation that my ancestors felt in the plantation while they were working on the plantation, the intimidation they felt, some of the negative attitudes they were exposed to, and the negative consequences of those are still with us today. We still are dealing with racism. We're still dealing with a lot of inequalities in the world, whether we're talking about here or here in the United States or in the colonies, the former colonies, where slavery happened, where colonization happened. So who's to say that those people still in those systems, they are still experiencing the brutality of those systems, the brutality of the system they created and left behind. And some of them, even if you say, well, they're no longer there, they actually has just been repackaged and revamped to look different, but they're actually the same. So to say the least, those people are not only mentally, they're not only victims of those oppressive systems. I'm surprised they are still living, but nonetheless they are living, but their mental health are greatly affected. Let's see if you guys have any questions. It lingers, Merci Vierge says, it lingers for us African Americans, the continuous insecurity with regards to racism, etc. Exactly. Merci Vierge, are you African American? I never asked. I guess you are. You said it here. Correct. Jobibi say, but how do we heal that PTSD? That's a good question. Well, I talked a little bit about the religions that's that's a big part of it, because during slavery we were forced to accept certain religions. So in an aspect, you have to ask yourself, well, what religion did we have prior to that? Everybody knows that society is built mainly on those systems, religions, government, and so forth. So religion is a big part of our lives. How we see the world, how we understand the world is based, how we see the cosmos is based on us human beings, how we understand it. So religion is, when religion comes, it takes one layer of that off. We no longer can see reality as it really is. We're now seeing it through the lens of religion, to the lens of what was told to you. In our case, African Americans, Black people all over, we see it through the lens of religion. And those religions were not our religion prior to slavery, prior to colonization. So it begs to ask then, how can we actually understand ourselves or the world if we are using something that never belonged to us? And you might say, well, we made it ours. You could make something out yours if it was given to you. You could make it yours, but you would then need to understand what it is you were giving and why it was given to you. But we never really understand that. So that's why it can never be yours. And you cannot solve a problem from the place where the problem started. You cannot solve it. So because we can't understand ourselves, as long as we use those religions, we'll never be able to understand ourselves. Spirituality and religion is different. And as long as we remain in those religions, we'll never be able to solve the problem. We can only solve it to the level of that religion says that it's solved. And in Christianity, for example, if we're talking about PTSD and slavery, they would just say to you, just pray it away. Pray that it goes away, basically, or pray that it act like it never happened. That's the best you can get. You're not going to get an answer. And what we want, the PTSD, part of the PTSD is, why did it happen? You want to know, why did it happen? Why did it happen to me? You mad about what happened, which you have every right to be. And how can I stop this from happening again? Or is it even happening now? And the question is, yes, it is happening now. It happened before. That's the answer to your question. It is happening now. How do you solve it now? If at least you could understand why it happened and how you could stop it from happening now to you yourself as an individual and as a race of people, that would then answer the questions that's causing you to not sleep at night, that's causing you to stay awake. But we can't even ask those questions because the same system that actually was part of, the oppressive system is the same system that you are praying to right now for mercy. How can that happen? I mean, just logical sense. That doesn't make any sense, logically speaking. You don't have to really dive deep into religion and mysticism or anything like that. Just doesn't make any sense. This was the same religion they gave you in order to get you into slavery, for you to become docile, for you to agree. And they told you that God said you had to be a slave. So how could you use that same religion yourself? How could you reconcile that within yourself? It's going to be very hard for you to reconcile because it doesn't make any sense, is what I'm saying. I wish this presentation was in Creole. I would have shared it with my community that I would rather believe the stranger's mouth. I understand that, Joby, but the book I'm talking about is written in English. So I want to promote the book. I don't know the author, by the way, so I'm not doing this for money. It's just that I read the book and it really resonated with me. I like the way it was written because it is written with a lot of humor, something that I know you really need in order for you to digest what's in the book. And it's written in English, of course, which is great for my English-speaking fans. And it's written in a way for you to see the relationship clearly between mental health and terror. And that's in a nutshell. That's what it is. Terror is a terror that we as a people, we have been dealing with for the past 600 years almost, whether it was in the plantation and up to today. Just recently we had, in this country, we had the election about the presidential election, Trump or Biden. Obviously now we're all happy that Biden won, but everybody was up in arms because they were thinking maybe Trump would win. And what would that do to this country? We couldn't take another 4 years of that. That would be terrible. Well, imagine living in that for 600 years or worse than that. Much worse than that. But just imagine that you had to live with that for 600 years or for 30 years with Papa Doc in this book as we're talking about for 30 years. Haiti has been no different, really. It's just a series. It's a series of the same thing happening. But imagine that. So that's just to give you in a nutshell the type of brutality, domination, oppression that's going on in the environment. And when you are in an environment like that, you have no choice but to internalize inside what's happening on the outside. And whatever you internalize inside, whether it's belief, like we just talked about the religious belief, that you may believe this or that, this is what's going to color your world. This is what's going to shape how you think. This is what's going to shape how you see the world. And if this is how we see the world from those negative experiences, because they are negative, they are brutal. They're not just negative, they are brutal. There's something to say about something that is brutal into one's, and internalizing this into one's psyche. And what happens to that human being then after that is the question. And so when we can understand it that way, then you could clearly see that mental health for us, it's not just a one-line diagnosis or a one or even a page diagnosis or a medication or a few interventions. You could see that it is a lot more complex than that. And until we Black people understand our mental ills from that perspective, then addressing, like you said, Joby, our PTSDs are going to be light years away, because we have to get to the root of the problem. We have to understand the cause of our PTSD. We have to understand that there are still systems in place that are still promoting such brutality, and we're still living them day to day, except someone said that earlier, and the author also mentions that, except we numb ourselves. We use alcohol, we use food, we use other substances to numb ourselves so we can sort of act like we're living a normal life. But in reality, we are living pretty sad lives because we feel that we don't have the power to be the human being that we can be, because we are constantly under oppressive system. I can say more. Let's see if you have any questions. What's the name of the book? Okay, so the book is called Tales from the Island of Papa Doc by Castro De Wash. It's on Amazon. I bought mine on Amazon. And this is the author as a young kid in Haiti, in a local Port-au-Prince local area called Martissant. He described in the book how prior to the dictatorship, how life was just, so serene in a small island where everyone in a small community, worked together, and, life was just great being together. Were there poverty? Absolutely. But at the same time, there were a lot of peace prior to the dictatorship. And of course, during the brutal 30 years of dictatorship, all that had changed, where everyone was, imagine a community where no one knows who anyone is. And what I'm saying by that is that it's not that you didn't know who your neighbor is, but you didn't know who your neighbor, what was your neighbor's affiliation with the Tonton Macoute. Were they friends? And if your neighbor had a friend who was a Tonton Macoute, and you had an argument with your neighbor, and you didn't have a Tonton Macoute that was higher than his Tonton Macoute, then your family could be gone. Your family could be exterminated. That's the kind of environment. It's no different than what we've seen. Some of this we're seeing here, this polarity that we're seeing here in this country. We saw it with Trump recently during the presidential election, where if you were in his camp and people who weren't in his camp, you could see like it was pretty close. It was pretty intense, as if something was going to explode, and something did explode actually when they went to the Capitol. That was an explosion. So again, we went through that again. as a people. Watching that, we went through that again. I'm sure it reminded us of the 60s in this country. I'm sure it reminded us of the Jim Crow era in this country. So those are constant PTSDs that are happening over, re-injuring over and over again. So the author talks about that in the book at great length. Again, the book is Castro de Roche, Tales from the Island of Papadoc. Let me see if you have any questions. Mental health is still a big challenge for us, Pierre Simon. Yes, absolutely. But for example, I talk about when I go to I go to therapy myself for whatever ills that I'm dealing with. And I know it's a small part of therapy for me in terms of how I address my mental health. But even that's a challenge, because in order for me to see a therapist, I would rather see a therapist, first of all, who can understand my culture, who can understand my history, who can understand me. Because if a therapist does not understand me, or does not understand what I'm talking about in terms of my culture, in terms of my history, for example, if I go to a therapist and I talk about Lugao, he will say like, what are you talking about? I says, yeah, it's this thing that comes to the windows at night and snatch kids and then, take the baby's fat. He's like, that doesn't make any sense. That's not going to make any sense to him. But to me, that's a real fear. That's a real fear that I grew up with. So if he can't understand that, first of all, that's not going to make me comfortable enough to even talk about it, much less to divulge myself completely. So you could see for us, even the treatment for mental health is also a challenge, because to find a therapist who can understand us, to find a psychiatrist who can understand us, who's not going to label us as schizophrenic, or who's not going to label us as paranoia. It's not paranoia that I'm thinking that a Lugao could come to the window, still taking baby's fat, as written by the author. This is real. If I have PTSD from the Tonton Macoute, that is real. But how do I explain that to a therapist? And why should I have to explain that? Because by that time, the role has changed now. I'm the therapist now, and he's the client. So it's very challenging, like you said, Pierre Simon, and that is why I decided to do the live. I wanted to talk about the book. I wanted to talk about the challenges around mental health, and how for us Black people, mental health is not just a 1 or 2 word diagnosis. It's a much more complex issue that we need to dive into to understand ourselves, each individual, of course, and as a community, we need to do that. We need to address these things as a community. If we are in church, religious people, I know that in the Haitian community, religious people don't want to talk about Lugao, don't want to talk about Tonton Macoute, don't want to get involved in politics. But these are real issues that affected people. And technically, if you are offering a service of peace, you should try to understand these things. You should allow people at least to divulge themselves and talk about what it is they feel in order for them to heal. Yes, you're right, Madame Pierre Simon. Perfect. Alain Desroches. Very good. Well, again, I'm going to introduce the book. This is the book. If you guys are interested, it's on Amazon. And I am going to end the discussion here. I have to say the author at the end of the book, of course, he's a professor. He made it out, but he lost a lot of family members. And this is a true story through the dictatorship. And we know that, we Haitians, we know that because at least every Haitian have lost one family member to the dictatorship of Duvalier. I know I had lost family members myself. So looking in the future for a better country, we would need to address some of these issues moving forward. When we talk about education, we need to think about how can we incorporate education in the society for us to understand ourselves better. We need to address what role does religion really play in one's life, especially in this specific society, because we have suffered at the hands of others as a result of religion, and religion being part of that oppression. So we have to dive into those subjects, and we have to make it clear what it means for us, because every society, something could mean something different for them, and that's perfectly okay. But for us specifically, who have been victims of slavery, victim of colonization, victim of inequalities and oppressions from colonial governments, imperialism, and so forth, we have to put these questions on the table. And if we really want to have a new country, if we want to have freedom, if we want to have a free country, if we want to be whole, we have to address these questions. Let's see if you don't have any other questions. I will end the live because I think I said enough. Mental health is as important as physical health. Yes, and I would go to say, who said that? Was Magali? Yes, I would actually say mental health is even more important than physical health, because think about if you broke 2 legs and you're laying in bed with your 2 broken legs. That's your physical health now, that's a state. But mentally you sound. Mentally you understand why your leg was broken, that it's going to be taken care of. That's the mental part, that you're okay. My legs are broken, but I'm laying in bed. I have my family around me. I have access to what I need, food and water, and the basic things of what I need. That's mental health. I believe in a higher power, whatever that is for you. Let's say you believe in a higher power. I am well. I'm not being punished by God. That's not why I broke those 2 legs. Imagine somebody who broke 2 legs who actually believes it's because something they did, and now that's why they're being punished. You can see how your agony, your pain of your broken legs would be very different than someone who's mentally healthy. So in that light, I say that mental health is a lot more important than physical health. I worked in hospice as a nurse, and when patients are dying, I see the difference between a patient who's dying, who has accepted his or her death mentally, who's okay with it, and versus one who doesn't accept it. And that's where mental health comes in. So you're definitely right, is what I'm saying. Okay. So we have to put the pieces together so we can find peace, Mr. Viege. Yes, absolutely. And in doing, and we're talking about it, talking in our community about this, talking in our families. Families can be a small community. In my own family, I dive into these subjects. I talk about everything. There's no taboo subjects in my family. I talk about the lugao. What did that mean for me? My kids certainly don't understand lugao, but it's a real thing for me. Did I ever see a lugao? No. But does it scare me? Even up to today, I know it doesn't exist anymore, but there's still a small. What's still there is the fear from the child who suffered the trauma. That's the PTSD we're talking about. My kids doesn't have that fear. But what I do is I talk to my kids about that fear that I had, but I put it together as the fear they have here. The fear of them driving outside and being stopped by a cop and being exterminated literally in 9 minutes like George Floyd was. That's the same fear when you think about it. I was afraid. I didn't want to die. My kids are has the same fear. They don't want to die for something that they didn't do, for unnecessarily death. So we have to, as a people, we know whether you're African American, I'm Haitian, you're Jamaican, we have to start to put the pieces together and see that it's actually the same thing in different ways. That's how we are being dominated and oppressed. Thank you. Talk about the ACE and the impact it has on long-term health. Judy Powell. Yes, Judy. Hi, Judy. Judy must join me. Yes, long-term health. We talked about a little bit about that. Long-term health for us in the Black community, for us Black people, like I said, it affects us greatly. And it can pass even through DNA. They have done research. They've seen that certain traits are passed down to our DNA, including a trait of depression. If you depress, you can actually pass that down to your kids. We know that now. Epigenetics, you can work with it if you now, you change the environment or you address it. You can change it, but it can pass through our DNA. And we all know all too well that one black family generationally doesn't really change 2, 3, 4 generations later. You know, the inequalities, the poverty, whatever was going on with that first generation, it takes about, you know, a few generations before we can see change in a black family. So that means the effect of it is actually cumulative. It just keeps happening and happening. And us in our home, we are our first mental health practitioners. We parents and children, you know, making it a safe place. Just like I often think about slavery when I read about it in books. Even the slaves, they always had their own quarters. This is where they laughed. This is where they sung. This is where they could be themselves. We have to do that now. Your home has to be the sanctuary where your family, your children can come and be themselves for real. So we have to do better in terms of providing a sanctuary in our home for our children, especially now with everything that's going on in the world, including COVID-19. A lot of children right now, unfortunately, their home lives are even at a greater crisis than it was prior to COVID. So we have to do better in educating ourselves and empowering ourselves so that we can empower our own families. The Black community also needs to invest in long-term health care insurance, life insurance, death insurance, yes, health care proxy, will and estate trusts, and to name a few. Definitely was Magali. Actually, Judy Powell, that's on the live, is an insurance, what do you call yourself, Judy? Is an insurance broker. So she deals with all that. You're right. But especially talking about the estate and the will, a lot of people sometimes lose their money because they didn't have an estate, they didn't have a trust fund or whatever. Exactly. So these are resources that we leave on the table. Exactly. So that's a great point you brought, was Magali. Thank you for that. I don't need the book, but your presentation about the affecting causes of our mental trauma as Black people. I don't need the book, but your presentation. Okay, thank you, Jobibi. If you want me to do the live in Creole, in my native tongue, I will try to do that. I don't think that community would like it, but I will try if you think I should. I'll ask the author if he thinks, that would be beneficial first, but definitely. So thanks everyone for coming to let's discuss this further. I would love to see your thoughts on this. I would love to see you either message me or put it in the comments. Put your own, like you did with Magali. I would like everyone here on this live to put down a comment about how they understand mental health from their own perspective, from their own family perspective, and what it is that they are doing to keep their own mental health, or in their own community or in their own family, because this is what we need. So that may help someone else if they read the comment. Even me, I'm always looking for ways, I'm always looking for solutions in how I can help myself and my family with their own mental health. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming to listening to me. Again, my name is Marlene. I'm a registered nurse. I do lives on health maintenance, disease prevention. I myself, I'm very passionate about health personally, but also it's also my passion to help other people with their own health. Because this is what I do professionally as my work, but I also do it. This is something I'm passionate about it personally as well. So thanks for coming. And like I said, jot down your questions or your comments and how you see things yourself, or what you think. If you want to, again, the book, if you want to get the book, I'm not getting paid for this at all. If you want to get the book, it's on Amazon. I'll jot down the name of the book under comments as well. And I'm not making money. That's my disclaimer. There's no money. I don't make any money. Just like I don't make any money when I do my Facebook lives, and I don't need any money. I'm already loaded. Thank you. That's not true. Anyway, thank you for coming. Have a great Saturday night, and I will see you guys again next time. Thank you. How to do this?